The man's name was John Phillips. He had a ship, a crew, and a set of written rules that every man aboard had signed, or marked with an X if he couldn't write. The rules covered everything: how plunder would be divided, what compensation a man received if he lost an arm in battle, what happened if someone brought a woman aboard disguised as a sailor, what happened if someone deserted before the cruise was finished. That last clause is the one that matters here, because in April 1724, one of Phillips's own crew members decided the life wasn't worth it anymore. He wanted off, and what John Phillips did in response, what the signed articles legally entitled him to do, what every man on that ship had agreed to before they ever left port, was something that naval historians have spent 3 centuries trying to describe with clinical precision because the ordinary language for it is simply inadequate. The romanticized version of piracy that fills popular culture, the freedom, the democracy, the brotherhood of men outside society's rules, is not entirely false. There was democracy. There were articles. There was a genuine system of governance that was, in certain respects, more sophisticated than anything operating on the naval vessels trying to hunt these ships down. But inside that system, underneath the articles and the equal shares and the compensation for lost limbs, there was a machinery of control so brutal and so deliberately engineered that the men who lived under it understood something the history books rarely say directly. The pirate code didn't just govern pirates, it trapped them. Start with what the articles actually were, because most people's understanding of pirate democracy is borrowed from fiction, and the fiction is incomplete. The written articles that governed pirate ships during the golden age of piracy, roughly 1690 to 1730, were real documents. Several have survived. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the era by any measure of ships taken, had articles that researchers can read today. Blackbeard's crew operated under articles. John Phillips's articles survived because they were introduced as evidence at his cruise trial in Boston in 1724. These weren't myths or approximations. They were functioning legal documents, and they were sophisticated. Roberts's articles divided plunder by specific ratios. The captain received 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5. Other officers graduated amounts, ordinary sailors 1 share each. This was more equitable than the Royal Navy, where prize money distribution was so heavily weighted toward officers that an ordinary seaman might receive a few shillings from a capture worth thousands of pounds. The articles guaranteed compensation for injury. Roberts's code specified 40 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 35 for a left arm, lesser amounts for fingers and eyes. There were provisions for musicians, specifically that they could not be forced to play on Sundays. There were rules about gambling aboard ship, about fighting below decks, about the handling of captured women. Reading these documents, the instinct is to see something almost admirable. A group of men who had been discarded by society, naval press gangs, merchant ships, poverty, violence, building their own system with their own rules and their own protections. That instinct is correct, and it misses the point entirely, because every one of those articles ended with the same clause, repeated in different forms across every set of pirate rules that has survived. The clause that specified what happened when you violated them. And what happened was not democratic. What happened was not equitable. What happened was a punishment system designed with the specific goal of making the alternatives to compliance, desertion, mutiny, cowardice in battle, psychologically impossible to choose. The most famous punishment in pirate history is marooning, and it is famous for exactly the wrong reasons. Popular culture treats marooning as a kind of dramatic exile. A man left on a deserted island with a pistol and a bottle of water, given a fighting chance at survival while being removed from the ship's company. The reality was calibrated to something much more precise than exile. A maroon was left on the smallest, most isolated piece of land the captain could find. Not an island with fresh water and fruit trees, a sandbar, a rock barely above the waterline, a strip of sand in the middle of open ocean with nothing growing on it and no fresh water within reach. The pistol was real. Roberts's articles specified 1 pistol, powder, and shot. But its intended purpose was not self-defense. It was the option to end things quickly when the thirst became unbearable, which it would, because on a featureless sand spit in the Caribbean sun, a man was dead of thirst within 2 to 3 days. The psychological engineering of this punishment was precise. Death was not the message. The interval before death was the message. The men who witnessed the marooning, who stood on deck and watched a crewmate rowed to a sandbar and left there, understood viscerally what those 2 or 3 days looked like. They had been at sea long enough to know exactly what dying of thirst felt like. The mental image that punishment planted in every watching sailor was not of a man on a desert island. It was of a man in full sun with no shade and no water watching the ship that left him grow smaller on the horizon. That image was the point. That image was what you thought about the next time you considered deserting. Bartholomew Roberts marooned a man named Harry Glasby in 1721 for attempting to escape. Glasby was a navigator, skilled, valuable, irreplaceable in open ocean navigation, which made his attempted desertion particularly dangerous to the crew's survival. Roberts didn't kill him. He left him on an island for several days, then retrieved him. The message to every other skilled crewman was precisely calibrated. You are valuable enough that we won't waste you, but we will show you what we could do, and next time we won't retrieve you. Glasby stayed. He navigated Roberts' ship for another year, but marooning was reserved for the relatively clean violations: desertion, cowardice, attempting to leave before the cruise ended. For violations that threatened the ship more directly, theft from crewmates, concealing plunder from the common stock, bringing weapons below decks while lit, the punishments operated on a different register entirely. Moses's law, 40 stripes, save 1, 39 lashes, appears in pirate articles as a direct borrowing from the biblical legal tradition, and its appearance there is its own kind of revelation. Pirates were not, as a class, particularly religious men. The fact that they reached for a religious legal framework for their punishment system tells you something about the psychological authority they needed that punishment to carry. 39 lashes administered with a cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, was not primarily a physical punishment, though the physical dimension was severe enough that men sometimes died from it or were permanently disfigured. It was a public ritual. Every man on the ship watched. The watching was mandatory, and the watching encoded in every observer's nervous system exactly what the articles meant when they said violations would be punished. This is the mechanism that governed pirate ships that no romantic account of pirate democracy adequately addresses. The articles were democratic in their creation. Crews voted on them, amended them, held their captains to them. But their enforcement was theater. Deliberate, public, witness theater designed to produce a specific psychological state in the audience. The state it produced was not fear exactly, though fear was an element. It was something more precise, a very clear understanding of the boundary between what was permitted and what wasn't, maintained through witnessed consequence, making that boundary feel as solid and real as the hull of the ship beneath their feet. Edward Lowe understood this psychology better than almost anyone operating in the Atlantic during the 1720s, and he applied it in ways that went considerably beyond what any pirate articles technically specified. Lowe is the figure that historians reach for when they want to demonstrate that the romantic vision of piracy has a limit, a point at which the system's internal logic, followed to its conclusion, produced something that even other pirates found disturbing. He began his career under Charles Harris, who operated with articles and a functioning crew democracy. He eventually commanded his own vessel and began interpreting the punishment provisions of his articles with a creativity that the documents themselves did not contain. A Portuguese captain who had thrown a bag of gold overboard rather than surrender it to Lowe's crew was the subject of what Lowe's crewman Philip Ashton, who later escaped and wrote a remarkable first-person account, described with a clinical horror that still comes through 3 centuries later. Lowe cut off the captain's lips. He cooked them. He forced the captain to eat them while they were still hot. Then he killed everyone aboard. This was not in the articles. This was Lowe's personal interpretation of what the enforcement of pirate authority required. And here is the most psychologically revealing aspect of the Low case. His crew continued to sail with him afterward. Not all of them, and not without documented discomfort. But the ship kept operating. Men kept signing on. Because the alternative was the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy had its own forms of the same logic. This is the context that pirate democracy only makes sense inside, and that most popular accounts of the golden age of piracy treat as background rather than foreground. The men who signed pirate articles had, almost universally, prior experience aboard legal vessels, merchant ships or naval ships, where the treatment of ordinary sailors was governed by its own brutal logic. Press gangs seized men off the street and delivered them to naval ships where captains had near absolute authority over their bodies. Flogging for minor infractions was standard. Pay was routinely withheld. Prize money disappeared into officer pockets. The food was inadequate, the conditions were dangerous, and a man who complained had no recourse. When pirates captured merchant vessels, they typically gave the captured sailors a choice: sign the articles or go free. A significant percentage signed, not because they were coerced, or not only because they were coerced, but because the articles they were signing represented a genuine improvement over the conditions they had been living under. This is the dark paradox at the center of pirate history. The pirate code was simultaneously more humane than the legal alternatives and more brutal in its specific enforcement mechanisms, more democratic in its creation and more theatrical in its violence, more equitable in its distribution of resources and more psychologically sophisticated in its methods of control. The men who signed understood or came to understand that what they were signing was not just a contract for shares and compensation. They were signing an agreement to live inside a system that would protect them from most of what the legal maritime world subjected them to, and that would punish any violation of its own rules with a precision and a public deliberateness that the legal world, for all its official violence, rarely matched. John Phillips's crew killed him in April 1724. The story of his death is the story of the pirate code consuming itself, which happened more often than the romantic accounts suggest. A carpenter named Edward Cheeseman had been taken by Phillips against his will, pressed into service the way the Royal Navy pressed men, which is itself a commentary on how far pirate democracy extended in practice. Cheeseman spent months planning. He identified which crewmen were also reluctant participants. He waited for a moment when Phillips was distracted, and then he and 3 other men took the ship in approximately 45 seconds of controlled violence. Phillips died by Cheeseman's adze, a carpenter's tool, not a weapon, used as a weapon because Cheeseman had thought carefully about what he could access without alerting anyone. His body went overboard. His head was cut off and preserved because Cheeseman understood that arriving in a Boston harbor with a pirate captain's body, but no head, was not going to produce the legal outcome he needed. He was right. The head was identified. Cheeseman and the other reluctant crewmen were acquitted. The willing members of Phillips's crew who survived were hanged. The articles John Phillips had written, the documents that every man aboard had signed, that specified what happened to deserters, that outlined the punishment system that had kept the ship functioning, were introduced at the trial, printed, distributed to the public, read in the newspapers. People were fascinated. They had always been fascinated. The pirate code occupied a specific place in the public imagination of the early 18th century that it has never entirely left. A system of rules built by men who had rejected the official world's rules, that was in certain ways more coherent and more honestly enforced than the official world's alternatives. What the newspapers didn't fully reckon with, and what 3 centuries of romantic accounts have consistently failed to reckon with, is what living under that system actually felt like from inside. The signed articles meant you could not leave. The compensation clauses meant the ship could break your body in its service and settle the debt in coin. The punishment provisions meant that the community you had joined, the one that offered you more than the Navy or the merchant service had, maintained its cohesion through the same instrument of public violence that every other human power structure has always used. The freedom was real. The trap was real. They were the same thing. Here is what this tells us. sitting with the full picture of what the pirate code actually was and actually did. Human beings, when placed outside the structures of official society, do not become free. They build new structures, and the structures they build reflect, with uncomfortable accuracy, the structures they came from, because those are the only models available, because the problems those structures were designed to solve are the same problems any group of people on a ship in open ocean has to solve, and because the distance between a democratic system of governance and an authoritarian one is, in practice, a great deal shorter than either looks from the outside. The pirate articles were a genuine innovation. The compensation for injury, the equal shares, the limits on captain's authority, these were real protections that real men fought to establish and maintain. Captains who violated the articles were voted out. Some were killed. The democracy was not theater. But the enforcement of the articles, the marooning, the lashes, the public witnessing, Edward Lowe's improvised interpretations, was the shadow the democracy cast. Every system of rules requires an enforcement mechanism. Every enforcement mechanism, taken to its logical conclusion, contains the possibility of Edward Lowe. The men who signed the articles understood this. They signed anyway because the alternative was worse. That calculation, the one that makes a brutal system preferable to the system it replaced, is not unique to pirates. It appears in every human institution that has ever needed to hold people together in dangerous conditions with inadequate resources and no external enforcement. It appeared in Nuremberg with Franz Schmidt. It appeared in the Chinese imperial court with Dong Xian. It appears, if you look carefully, in every place where human beings have needed to maintain order under conditions that make ordinary social contracts impossible. The pirate ship was just unusually honest about it. The articles were written down. Everyone signed. The punishments were specified in advance. There was no pretense that the system existed for anyone's benefit but the ship's survival. In that sense, in that specific, limited, deeply uncomfortable sense, the pirates were telling the truth.